David, we just spent some time recently with a heroin addict who would inject street heroin intravenously. How dangerous is heroin?
Well, heroin is a pretty dangerous drug, particularly when you inject it. Just as an aside, if people have a choice, we'd much rather people smoked heroin than injected it, because for two reasons. But injecting heroin can give you an accidental overdose. So the ratio between a safe dose of heroin and a lethal dose of heroin can be as low as sort of 1 in 4, 1 in 5 in a non-experienced user. Right, that will get bigger. So if you get tolerant, then the safety margin goes up. But of course, then if you lose tolerance, if, for instance, you're in prison and you come out of prison and you go back to your previous habit, then you can die because you think you
can handle a bigger dose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So heroin is a dangerous drug, especially when given intravenously. Whether you can die of it smoking it is pretty unclear. I suspect you can't, because I suspect you just fall over and stop inhaling.
Crash out or something before you can. Yeah.
If you have prescribed heroin in a controlled situation, so that overdose isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
If you know what you're doing and you're treating yourself, as we've known we have addicts going back to the 1950s who were controlled heroin addicts. They took it 3 times a day, ampules, sterile needles. As far as we know, that hasn't really impacted on their life expectancy. The problem with heroin comes if you don't have it in that pure form, that clean form. Then you have to run all the risks of needle sharing, HIV, hep C, and also some cases of infections. Some of the importations of heroin from Afghanistan have been accidentally contaminated with spores of things like anthrax and other bugs, which, when you inject them into you, can kill you.
What other drugs are harmful other than...
well, when we did our scale of harm for the Lancet paper a few years ago, we looked at about 20 drugs and we ranked them according to a range of harms. In terms of the drugs which are most likely to kill you when you use them, are apart from the opiates, so there's heroin and methadone, and then there are drugs like the sedatives, so drugs like GHB, GBL. The safety ratio there may be only, again, about 1 in 4, 1 in 5, quite low. And it gets worse if you're drunk as well, because alcohol is like those kind of drugs. And alcohol itself, the safety ratio is maybe about 1 in 10.
So is alcohol way up there with heroin in terms of being dangerous?
In population terms, alcohol is the most dangerous drug. Alcohol acutely kills by poisoning, kills about 300 people a year, and heroin kills about 300, and methadone about 300. So yeah, they're similar in the sense of the numbers who die, but the portion of users who die is obviously a lot less for alcohol, because there's just so many more users. There's 500,000 maybe heroin users and 40 million alcohol users. But alcohol is dangerous, yes.
And does it make sense then to sort of divide drugs into legal ones and illegal ones? Well, ostensibly on the basis of harm, but
pharmacologically it doesn't. So I mean, the reason we have drugs divided into legal and illegal is a historical sort of artifact. I think it's come about because people haven't thought very rigorously what drugs are. A lot of politicians don't even think alcohol's a drug.
No,
I mean, because it's not legal. Because it's not illegal, people think it isn't a drug.
They define a sort of drug as something which is illegal.
Yeah, that's right, and that's one of the problems. And of course, not all cultures do that. I mean, if you go back 1,000 years, Islam decided alcohol was a dangerous drug, changed people's mental state too much, so they banned it. I was sharing a discussion with a Moroccan psychiatrist a few weeks ago, and he said, we've done a study in Morocco where alcohol is illegal and cannabis is illegal. And he said, we now know that about 3.5% of our population are alcohol dependent and about 2.7% are cannabis dependent. So that gives you some rather good data on the relative harmfulness or addictiveness of these two drugs anyway. And certainly alcohol dependence is going to shorten your life more than cannabis dependence.
Do the legal and illegal categorizations of drugs correspond at all with the relative harm they do?
Very little. So what we found was, that the most harmful drugs were the ones, I suppose, that everyone would accept the most harmful. That was heroin and cocaine, particularly crack cocaine. And then alcohol was up there alongside barbiturates.
Right.
And tobacco was about halfway up. And tobacco's lower, although it kills a lot of people. It takes a long time to kill them, so
Yes.
it doesn't reduce their life expectancy as much as, say, heroin or alcohol, which kill
Right.
young people. So tobacco is in the middle, and then some of the other Class A drugs, like ecstasy, were right down the bottom. So there was no relationship between the classification of drugs in this country and the harms as we assess them.
So, I mean, this surely kind of reflects a sort of very confused approach to...
Well, that's the point we've made. We've argued a lot that the drug laws, and we're not the only ones who've argued this, but the current drug laws do not reflect scientific evidence. So they're unjust if you apply them, because they don't penalise appropriately the harms of the drugs. But more than that, and I think perhaps most importantly, they undermine people's confidence in what government's telling them about the harms.
Yes, yeah.
Because if you tell them that ecstasy is a Class A drug and very harmful when everyone knows it isn't, then it kind of devalues all the messages, because why should you trust the government on anything?
Yes, yes, yeah. No, it seems like a daft thing to kind of promote disrespect for the law, from the word go, really, which is essentially what's happening.
Absolutely, that's exactly right, and that's what it's doing, and it's fascinating to think about why it hasn't changed, and because I'm sure all politicians know that the actual current classification system is rubbish.
Yes, yes.
I think they're just there. There's a sort of funny sort of standoff. I think politicians are scared of the media. The media, I think, quite like the power they have in terms of manipulating political decisions. I don't think the media actually care. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people in the media take drugs. In fact, we know they do. They often tell us they do, and a lot of them are in treatment for it.
Yes,
but they just enjoy winding politicians up. And then both of them say, well, but of course it's the public that really care about these things. And when you talk to the public, you realise the public actually have a much more mature attitude to these drugs than politicians. The public actually know the truth. They're much more likely to believe the scientists than politicians.
If there was a referendum, David, do you think people would want to legalise drugs?
That depends on how the referendum was constructed and how the question was framed. But I suppose if you could properly sample public opinion on drugs, I think what people would say is that they know the laws are wrong, they know the classification's wrong. They would say that they're still scared of people using drugs and they would like a deterrence. But most of them don't think that imprisonment is the right approach. And certainly it's not. When you speak to the public and you explain the consequences of getting a criminal record and how that completely changes people's lives against the possible harms of drugs, which in most cases are either minor or not at all, people then begin to realise. So when you do public consultation, the public actually quite rapidly understand that this is a very anomalous situation. But of course, if you were to have a referendum, it's very likely you'd have a huge amount of media clamour.
And influence.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think what you have to do is do it in a more sophisticated way and do it with public meetings, do it with consultation groups, focus groups. And when the Academy of Medical Sciences did that, they were very impressed. In their recent report, they showed that the public actually can understand the issues. They can understand the dangers, but they can also understand the perverse consequences of misclassifying drugs, and they can also understand the damage that criminalisation does. And so they have a more mature view than politicians, I think.
How do you think we could change the politicians' view?
I think we have to continue to promote the evidence, the scientific base of drugs and drug harm. So programs like this, we have to continue to get scientists and public health doctors and also sociologists and social scientists to keep pointing out that drugs are but one aspect of harmful behaviour, and there are many other behaviours which we tolerate or even encourage. And I think we need to get people to think very clearly and transparently about what they're concerned about. A lot of the fears about drugs are ill-founded because people are either consciously or subconsciously absorbing this sort of the message of harm that's been perpetuated deliberately perpetuated by kind of political motivations going back to the 1960s, where there were huge concerns about society changing forever because of drugs. And of course what's happened, and what I find particularly frustrating at present, is that we've had repeated examinations of drugs like cannabis and now ecstasy in this country, and a denial of the truth about those. And while we've been focusing on the rows about cannabis and ecstasy, people have completely ignored this rising damage from alcohol.
Yeah.
Alcohol-related damage is wiping out the health service.
Yes.
1 million hospital episodes last year from alcohol.
Was it a million?
1 million, 250,000 hospital admissions, either primary or secondary related to alcohol. The alcohol, liver disease will become the commonest cause of death in this country. It'll overtake heart disease in about another 12 years. Most of that's driven by the rise in alcohol. So alcohol there's an epidemic
Yes.
that's sweeping through this country. If much more profound than any epidemics we've ever had in relation to AIDS
Yes.
or hepatitis, and much more than any damage we're getting from drugs like ecstasy or mephedrone.
Of the recreational drugs.
But we're not, people are so obsessed with the recreational drugs. They're taking their eye completely off the ball of alcohol. And that's what I was saying when I got sacked.
Yes, yeah.
That's the message, really. It's,
Yeah.
if we want to improve public health, deal with alcohol. And in fact, I think there's a danger that by over-criminalising, over-penalising other recreational drugs, you're driving people to use alcohol. So that's one factor why alcohol use has gone up. And the other factor is that, of course, the real price has gone down. I mean, alcohol is a third what it was when you and I were students.
Yes, yeah.
And alcohol intake has gone up by about 2 times.
Yeah, yes. Is there any recreational drug you would prohibit?
I'd be quite cautious about any kind of regulated access to strong opiates like heroin or crack cocaine, because I just can't quite see how that wouldn't be potentially dangerous. So if you were to, if you could go into a pub and have crack rather than alcohol, crack is more dangerous than alcohol, then I would find that difficult. I think I'm coming to the view that drugs which are less dangerous than alcohol should be available in some kind of regulated form. But I think I would see alcohol as at that sort of threshold.
Right, yes. What factors did you consider when looking at the relative harms of legal and illegal drugs?
We took 9 factors, broken into 3 groups. The first group related to the harms the drug did to the person taking it.
Right, the specific individual who took it. Yeah.
That's right, the individual harms to the person,
Yeah.
such as overdose deaths, such as chronic lung disease with
Yes.
smoking, for instance.
Yeah.
And also the likelihood of it being taken intravenously, because intravenous use has a major impact on the harms.
Well, yes, because of dirty needles.
Exactly,
and everything,
exactly.
Yeah.
And then we looked at the likelihood of the drug to cause dependence, how pleasurable it was, how much physical withdrawal you got, and how much psychological withdrawal you got. Because, of course, dependence is a major variable in determining the use of a drug.
Yes.
And then we looked at social harms. We looked at the consequences of being intoxicated with the drug, such as drunk driving offences, such as fights with alcohol. We looked at the damage that drugs did to communities, things such as criminality, such as street markets. And then we looked at the healthcare costs. So people being admitted for hospital, with alcohol-related problems or with opiate overdoses, etc.
Right.
And on each of those variables, we scored each drug from 0 to 3. And then we were able to give a total of up to 27.
Yes.
And then we ranked according to the total.
What percentage of drug users do you think are problematic users?
So problematic use usually refers to an individual that either has trouble stopping using or has to engage in changes in lifestyle in order to maintain their habit.
Right.
Because they want to continue it, but they can't afford it. So it covers those different kinds of variables. So the most addictive drug is, of course, tobacco, where about 40% of people who ever start smoking end up being dependent on it. So that's, and about half of people who ever smoke die of it. So that's in that sense, that's the most problematic. But of course, that doesn't distort people's lives because they can buy the drugs. There's no criminality associated with it, and also there's not much intoxication. They don't change their behaviour. If you look to other drugs, then of course drugs like heroin and crack get people addicted very fast. So that then engages them in the addiction process with all the secondary consequences, such as loss of jobs, such as criminality, shoplifting to raise money to buy the drugs, etc. Alcohol also probably about 10% of people who use alcohol end up having a serious alcohol dependency, which is very problematic. At the other extreme, you have drugs like MDMA, ecstasy, probably some of the other amphetamines, which actually seem to cause relatively little degrees of dependency and addiction. So there, people can use them at weekends on a regular basis for years without getting problems.
Is dependency necessarily a bad thing? I mean, presumably we're all addicted in some sort of sense to oxygen in a kind of a puerile, naive way. But
well, I think you've got to be a bit careful how you talk about the term addiction and dependence. Yes, we're all dependent on oxygen to live. Physical dependence on a drug is not necessarily a problem, provided you've got the drug. Just like dependence on oxygen is not a problem if you've got the oxygen. But of course, the downside of dependence is if the drug's doing you any harm.
yes.
So
yes.
then you've got dependence perpetuates or magnifies that harm.
Yes.
So,
or if it's causing you dysfunction, of course. Then
well, then
dependency,
absolutely.
yes, yeah.
But if you take a case, say, I mean, I suppose the example most of us would be dependent on caffeine. Most of us drink enough coffee to have a degree of dependence, and if we stop drinking, and that's typically what happens on the so-called Saturday morning headache.
Yes,
People
yeah.
drink a lot of coffee in the week, they stop on a Saturday morning, get a headache. So there's a degree of dependence on caffeine, but it doesn't really interfere with life. Tobacco dependence is the next most common dependence in society. Again, people function completely normally until the consequences of smoking, the lung disease or the cancer or the heart disease starts to kick in. So you're right, if the drug didn't harm you, dependence wouldn't be a problem. People have used the analogy like insulin, people.
Right.
Or
yes,
even,
yeah.
I mean, we have many people on long-term antidepressants. They're not dependent. They need them to keep their depression at bay. Antihypertensives, statins, keep your...
Yes, yeah.
So there are many drugs in the sense we're dependent on, as long as they're not doing us harm. Dependency
doesn't
itself is not a problem.
Until recently, David, you were chairman of the advisory council for the misuse of drugs. Did that position enable you to work out much about government drug policy?
Well, it told me what I suspected beforehand, that the current policy wasn't well founded in either science or evidence. There was very little research done on whether the policy actually worked. And one of the more amazing statistics we discovered when we were looking at the use of cannabis was that in 1971, when it was made illegal for medicinal use, there were about 500,000 ever users in the country. And now, 30 years on, it's 10 million, so there's a 20-fold increase.
Yes, yeah.
So that the sort of policy hasn't really had an
from their
impact there, from that point of view. But there's very little research on the policy interventions, which is, I thought, rather sad, because you'd hope that policy would be based on evidence.
Yes, yeah.
And that's across all the drugs, really. Also, there's a lot of policy seems to be made in relation to what the media are going to say.
Do you think the media have a really big role in determining?
I think some media do. I think the media actually have a very, very negative role. And there's actually research been done on that. There was a fascinating PhD done by a guy called Forsyth in Scotland, who showed that the media reporting of deaths in which drugs were measured in the plasma was completely distorted, and that every ecstasy death got reported in the media, whereas if you died of paracetamol,
It wouldn't get, yeah.
1 in 300 got reported. If you died of heroin, 1 in 50. So the media have a very biased view of the relative harms of drugs, and they really go for certain drugs. And we've seen this recently with mephedrone. I mean...
This was recently been criminalised, of course.
That's right, it has. And based on so-called public concern, which is really mostly police and media concern.
Yes.
The police and the media sort of get into a vicious circle where they hype each other up to an explosion. Cases are brought up of supposed deaths, which turn out not to be related to the drug at all, but the drug is banned just in case. And I thought it's very unsatisfactory. It's very unscientific, and I also think a bit cowardly. Actually, I think politicians don't have the courage to actually stand up for their convictions anymore. And I just hope the new lot will.
But do you think there's any hope of the government taking a rational attitude towards forming a drug policy?
I'm always hopeful, and I think there's a chance now. We've got this new coalition in place. To be fair, the Lib Dems have been very supportive. When I got sacked, the Lib Dems supported me.
Yes.
When I got harangued by the previous Home Secretary Jackie Smith over the horse riding article,
Yes.
the Lib Dem supported me. They've always supported a rational view about drugs.
Yes, yes.
So I'm very pleased we have a coalition.
Yes.
If we
yes.
hadn't, I think we could be in for a really difficult ride. But I think the Lib Dems will probably moderate this government, frankly.
Well, they've always always been very prepared to look into the matter, haven't they? In the way that the other the two major parties have.
That's right. I think they've always been open-minded about the question, and they're more science-based and less driven by sort of political ideology, more
Yes.
interested in actually doing what's right rather than, what their party members want them to do.
Yes.